It starts with an itch and a tingle, and then it builds and expands. And suddenly, all at once, my legs won't let me stand. I scratch till my fingers go numb.
Welcome to the Suicide Sucks podcast. Okay, so hi everyone, welcome to the podcast. We are branching out overseas. Can you believe it? We are going all the way to Oklahoma, which is amazing. It's our first overseas guest on the podcast, so thank you very much, Kimberly.
Yeah.
A little bit about Kimberly's background. She runs a coaching business, which is neuroscience based, and she's described as the renegade coach for women who live by their rules in their full potential. I absolutely love that. Kimberly has had quite a lot of experience with the topic of suicide. She has experienced suicide ideation since she was the age of 13. She was left with PTSD after losing everything in a flood. And she's experienced lots of different therapies, including EMDR, which for those of you who don't know what that is, because I didn't, it's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And it's a type of psychotherapy. At the age of 35, Kimberly ended up in a psych hospital. And now, in her 40s, she's here to tell the tale. And she's going to hopefully led us into a little bit about what her darkest days have been and ultimately how she's overcome them. So, Kimberly, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today and welcome from sunny Oklahoma.
Hey, Mick. Yeah, I'm so happy to be here. I almost feel bad that I live in such a sunny place.
Oh, well, I'm going to say don't feel bad, but actually, we've had enough rain now. It's so depressing. To cheerier things. Not really, but can you? I always like to dive in straight into the deep end and literally start with that question. Tell us a little bit about one of your darkest days.
Yeah, so that would be the day that I went into the psych hospital. It was a Monday. I mean, it's not like the journey is like one day happened, right? It's like it's the accumulation of things, right? I like to describe it to you get to that one day where it's like the straw that broke the camel's back, right?
Absolutely.
I was already struggling with PTSD. And I had already had like 6 different therapists over the 10 years, right? By the way, my master's degree is in counseling, so I'm also like educated in this. And then arriving at that day, what happened was I was dating this guy, and he was also my coworker, and he broke up with me on the weekend. And then I showed up to work on Monday, and like I sat right next to him. And it wasn't the fact that he broke up with me. Like that's what like my family blamed it on. It was that moment that had compounded for years telling me I had no control over my life, and nothing was ever going to change. And for me, that neural pathway, when I hit that neural pathway of like nothing is ever going to change, it's always going to be like that. That is a direct superhighway to suicide ideation. Well, I'd already been struggling with that, right? So I already had a plan. I already had, I'll call it the means. I won't be graphic. I mean, I had the means, I had the plan, right? And so when I showed up to that work on Monday and I saw him, and it was just a reminder, like, my life is always going to be so hard, and it's always going to be me never getting what I want and it always being unhappy, and it's never going to change no matter how hard I try, no matter what I do, no matter how many therapy sessions, no matter how healthy I eat or how I exercise. Like, it's never going to change. It's always going to be like this. And I think in that, like, the combination of those thought processes, being in the same room as him, it sent me like into this panic attack, and my brain, like, it snapped almost. It was like it's constantly cycling for me that day. Like, it's never going to change. It's never going to change. It's always going to be like this. And I was like, I can't, I'm not going to live another 40 years like this. This is already 30 something years of like it being hard. I'm not doing another 30. Um, so yeah,
Yeah, I
I
think you,
go ahead.
you said about how, it was the straw that broke the camel's back. And that's something I hear a lot when I'm doing these interviews, is that a lot of family and friends focus in on that one thing.
Yeah.
And actually, with the whole topic of suicide, there's just so many things, and it just becomes another one on in that list. Um, and like you say, that cycle of nothing's ever going to change, and that's that kind of deep dark hole, isn't it?
Hmm.
So that day, obviously, something happened to make it the darkest day. How did you get through it?
So, um, I am not, I mean, because I have like struggled with suicide ideation since I was 13, right? So that's a lot of years of like becoming very familiar with those thoughts. I was just never one of those ones that was like, I'm gonna leave this like sad letter for my family type. It was like, I'm just gonna go out and I don't want to struggle and fight with people. This is the one thing I can control in my life, is whether I live or not. And I'm laying claim to that, right? So as my brain was spinning and like, it's never going to change, it's never going to change, and I was kind of like having these panic attacks, there was like that small, like 5% of me that was like that wanted to live, right? That just that very tiny little echo. And I called my best friend, who was basically like my family. Like, I loved her more than anyone. And I was like, I can't do it anymore, Erin. I can't. It's nothing's ever going to change. Um, and I just want to tell you that I love you. And in that moment, she also has a counseling background. We'd worked together. She was like, she knew me well enough to not like beg me, like, don't do this, because she knew I wouldn't like listen. Um, she went into her little bossy pants mode, and she was like, if you really, a manipulation too, if you really loved me, like you say that you loved me all these years, and you haven't been lying to me, then you will get off the phone with me and you will call your dad and tell your dad that you need help, and you will drive home. And when you get home, you will call me. If you really loved me like you said you do. And that was enough for me, like, okay, like, because I did love her and I didn't want to be a liar to her. I was like, I can honor that. I can do that. And what also was really helpful, I want to like clarify, is she was directive. I'm not in a state where I can think and problem solve and think rationally, right? My brain has been hijacked with like, it's done. I can't do this. And for her to like give me very clear directions. You'll call your dad and you will drive home, right? It wasn't like, call the suicide helpline, or like, you should have so much to live for, or blah, blah, blah. Like, I have no capability at that point, right? It was just like,
Yeah.
follow the direction, call dad, drive home. So I called my dad. I was like, I need to talk to you. Erin told me to call you. I drove home. Um, he gathered me up. He sat on the couch and like I was crying, and he held my hand and he was like, I'm gonna get you help. I don't know what to do, but I'm going to get you help. And he loaded me up in the car and he took me to his doctor friend. And he sat in the exam room with me, and the doctor friend asked what was going on. And dad told him. And then he asked me, like, are are you wanting to end your life? Yes. I'm not gonna lie, I'm not a liar. Do you have a plan? Yes. Do you have the means? Yes. And then they loaded me up and took me to the psych hospital and checked me in at I don't know, 7 p.m. at night.
Wow. When you spoke to your dad, was that the first time that you'd ever that he was aware of how you were feeling?
Yes, but it wasn't like a conversation. Like it was me like hysterical and like, I can't do this anymore, Dad. I cannot, I can't live anymore. I'm done. I just cannot do this. And by the end of the day, like I'm done.
Mm. So did you get like checked? You got checked in that night then to the psych hospital, and
Yep.
how did you feel then?
Um, it was one of the most scary moments of my life, right? They pull you in, you go through intake, and that was, I remember she's like, okay, what was your plan? What is your means? Right. And I'm like, yeah, so then they take you into the room with everybody else, all the other inpatients, and they just sit you there. Like I remember it was a dark room, and I was in this room with all these other inpatients that I didn't know. I was in a full-on panic attack, and I don't know if you've ever had a panic attack. It's terrifying. Then a full-on panic attack, and they're intaking. We're sitting in this dark room, uh, waiting for bedtime and waiting for our meds to be dispensed. Um, And one lady came up to me, and she was an older lady and she had a wig on, and she was like the sweetest woman ever. And she was like, honey, you're going to be okay. And she had had cancer and chemo, and that like really messes with your mental health. And I went in January 3rd. Yeah. And then you had like your opioid addicts, and then, people that were suffering from schizophrenia or bipolar. And then you had me that was like, I'm not an addict. I don't have schizophrenia. I don't have bipolar. Right. I just had a shit ton of trauma. And my only coping mechanism when the flood happened, like religion was my coping mechanism. When the flood happened, I walked away from religion. So I didn't have any coping mechanisms left. So all this
Mm,
trauma has stacked and stacked and stacked. And now I'm in a place with no coping mechanisms, right? And
mm,
I had no bandwidth to handle anything. So they would just kind of leave me in the room by myself while the rest of them went out to like group, like substance abuse, counseling, whatever. But what I learned was like, I'm not as depressed as I thought I was being around some of those people. And then when I got out,
how long were you in there for?
a week.
Oh
Most
gosh.
people had been in there for months, and they told me like, once you get in, it's hard to get out of here. Um, and I hung around with the opioid addicts because they were the closest to me.
Oh
And I would
gosh.
just be like, how the fuck do I get out of here? Right? Like, I can't stay here. I have a job. I was having to hide, like, because you don't want your hospital. And they're like, dude, just like engage with people, smile, make sure they see that you're eating your food, take your pills. Like, you'll have a meeting with a psychiatrist every Thursday. So when I met with him, I went on Monday, and when I met with him on Thursday, I was like, I have a job. Like, if I stay in here like longer, like, I'm gonna lose this job.
Were
Um,
you what job was that at the time?
I was working in higher ed with
Right.
veterans, which was like some of them were crazy, and I was just as crazy as they were. So I was like, yeah, I didn't care about that job. I just wanted out of that place, right? So I got out pretty quickly. Most people had been in there for months and months and months. But when I got out, I realized two things. Like, no one was coming to save me, and no God was going to come save me. If I wanted a different life, it was It was all on me. And I knew
Yeah.
I was never going back to a psych hospital.
Yeah.
I also realized that unless I like was drunk off my ass, I did not have the, I hate phrasing this way, but this is just how it felt. I didn't have the courage to, so I knew like I don't have the courage and I'm not going to a psych hospital. So something's got to change.
Mm. And I think that is the difficulty with it all, really, is that it, from the people that I've spoken to anyway, it doesn't appear that it will ever get any better until you reach that realization that you have to want to do it yourself. You have to want
Oh
to
yeah.
climb out of that hole yourself, because, like you
Yeah.
say, nobody else is going to do it for you, which is just so tough
Yeah.
when you're in that black hole.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm,
I mean, that was rock bottom, right? Like there's no farther to go down at that point. So I had a choice. Like,
yeah. And I think it's really interesting, like for anybody listening who is like worried about a friend or a family member, the fact that when you called your friend and you said about the whole, like taking control and giving you actions to do, I think that's genius. That's like, I reckon that is really important to give you like three instructions just for that moment in the now to follow like steps.
yeah.
Yeah.
For me, it was. I mean, it may not be for everybody,
Mm,
but like for me, it was. And like because I study neuroscience now, right? And like how the human brain works. And what happens is like you go into that primal brain, right? Our prefrontal cortex is our ability to reason, to plan, to think logically, right? To have goals. When you're living in survival state, which is like the parasympathetic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system, right? Fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Most of us that are like at that place of suicide ideation, we have passed fight, flight, and now we're like in freezing,
mm. Oh,
right?
that was really strange then, because as you said the word freezing, you froze
Mhm.
on the screen. You
Oh, that is
froze.
strange. That is strange. Yeah. So like we're in freeze. We don't have access to that like logic and reasoning, right? So then to ask
Mm,
people in that state, like, it's like life is worth living. You're like, you're gonna hurt all these other people if you leave. You're like, I don't give a shit. You know why? It is so painful for me to exist another hour. And then you're gonna ask me to like think about this or like think about other people's feelings. Like, I don't have access to that part of my brain to do that.
yeah. But so what's the answer then for people who want to help somebody who is struggling in that way?
I mean, for me, and I've coached some women that are struggling with it because I've been through this. I'm very no BS, right? I'm like, oh, you're struggling with, okay, what's your plan? And do you have the means to do it? All right. Like you got two choices. Like you're gonna do it, or I'm calling social services and they're gonna come pick your ass up now and you're gonna go to the psych hospital. Like, what choice, like how serious are we are about this? Right. So I'm just very direct with it. And
Yeah.
then I'll tell them, like, like the psych hospital isn't a resort. Like, this is how scary and how fucked up it is. Like,
Mm, yeah.
we have to make this, we have to take responsibility. For me, it's very direct, not tiptoeing around this shit. Like I think people that want to help think that they're gonna like plant ideas.
That is definitely something that I come across all the time. Yeah.
Yeah,
That you're going to inadvertently encourage somebody to take their own lives, which is just ridiculous, isn't it?
yeah,
And I love your attitude of no bullshit, because that is what this is all about, really. The reason it's called Suicide Sucks is because suicide sucks. Say the word. People don't even say the word, and it's ridiculous. So, for the fact that you've just said, if somebody's feeling like that, instead of saying, oh, well, why don't you reach out to the Samaritans or this, you know, actually say, have you got a plan? And talk about it. Yeah, I love it. That's brilliant. Yeah. I think we all
People want to
need
be
to
heard
do
and
that.
seen, right? And let me tell you this, and I can get passionate about this. When you tell me, like, I think you said the Samaritans, like, if I'm telling you we're friends, right, and you're like suspecting something's going on, I'm like, well, you should reach out to the Samaritans. You know what that tells me in the moment? Again, I'm not in logical reasoning. What it tells me is that you don't give a shit enough about me to be honest with me and to care about me and be there in the moment. You want to pass me off to someone else instead of having the courage and the gumption and the bravery to be like, dude, I see that you're struggling. And what's going on? Like, are you thinking about suicide? Okay. Do you have a plan? Do you have the means to the plan? What do you want to do with this? Like,
Yeah.
that tells me you care.
Yeah. It's really interesting because, you know, people are unaware that they could be sending out that message that appears like they don't care. The person advising that thinks that they're being caring, don't they? But it's so far from the truth. Yeah. It
I
needs
mean,
to
think
be,
about like, so we have this, so what's happened is like we're in this thought loop, right? Like for me, the thought loop is like nothing's ever going to change. Okay. So I have that belief, I have that thought. My reticular activating system in my brain now is going to find evidence. Everywhere I look in the world, it's going to only find evidence that nothing is ever going to change. Right? So it's interpreting everything I see, everything I smell, everything I touch, everything I taste, every interaction is like, see, nothing's ever going to change. See, nothing's ever going to change. Right? So if people that have the thought loop, like, no one cares about me, their Raz then, when someone says, well, you should call the Samaritans, interprets that information as, see, they don't care.
yeah, yeah. So is it obviously you came out of the psych hospital and you realized that nobody was coming. You had to do this yourself. So how do you do that? You've decided that actually you haven't got the courage and you don't want to be in the psych hospital. I'm assuming it's all about mindset and changing your your loop, really. How did you go about doing that for yourself?
Well, of course, when you exit the psych hospital, you have to go to therapy. But you don't really have to, like, nobody checks, like, here, nobody checked on me. Like, nobody followed up from the psych hospital and threatened me, like, if your ass doesn't do these things, we're pulling you back in here. Like, nobody did that. They didn't check whether, are you taking your meds? Like, are you going to therapy? But because I'm like, like I'm not super defiant. I was like, okay, I'll go to therapy, right? So I go to therapy. It was fine. It was therapy. Right, we're going to talk about the trauma, whatever. Um, but I just had so much of a resolve at that point. Like I have to be the hero of my story because I'm not like the fear of going back to a psych hospital because now all eyes are on me,
Hmm.
right? They're on to me at this point.
Hmm.
My family, my friends, right? Uh and just the fear of having to go back to that place was like, I have to figure this out. Like I at that point, my brain also got rid of the ideation that this was a possibility because it was holding on to suicide as a possibility to escape, kind of as like a comfort blanket,
Yeah.
right? And that comfort blanket turned out to be a nightmare. So my brain was willing to let go of that as an option. Um, and then what really changed, so I didn't have that option anymore. And I knew I had to go, like, I had to change my life. So I took the meds and I went to therapy and then I started feeling better. I changed jobs. I went after my dream job. because at that point I had nothing to lose in my life, right? I was like, I've already been rock bottom. Like it can't get worse. Uh, and I started reading this book because I was like, okay, this is all on me. I was divorced, recently divorced. Like, this is all on me. If I want a different life, I got to figure out how to be successful. Like, I don't want to live paycheck to paycheck anymore. So I was reading this book and she said, like, if you want to be successful, get a coach. So I was like, I don't know what that is. Googled it and I found the life coach school. And I listened to two podcast episodes. And the reason I'm telling you this is because this was like the thing I think that was like the second thing that changed my life. She taught me the model, and the model was circumstances, C line, are neutral. They're not good nor bad. T line, you have a thought about that circumstance. That thought creates an emotion. The emotions drive our actions or inactions, and the actions create the results in our life. So if you want a different result, you have to have a different thought. And that was like, what? That's where all these emotions are coming from, are these thoughts. And like these thoughts aren't even factual. Like the majority of our thoughts are stories,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Yeah.
And like she taught me like how to prove like a thought is true or factual, not true, but factual is like, is it provable in a court of law? If it's provable in a court of law, it is a factual thought. All
Mhm.
the rest are subjective interpretation of reality. And that changed my life. It was like, oh.
That's amazing. Yeah.
That's where all these emotions, because I felt so powerless to these emotions. Like they were overwhelming to me. And I was like, I'm creating these, not the other humans. I don't get to spend all my time trying to like control all the humans. Like,
Yeah.
so I am in control of my life because this
Yeah.
is where my brain creates control. This is where it comes from.
And
That was
that's
life
fascinating.
changing.
And that's like when you realize that you've got choice and you
Yeah.
can make choices and go after your dream job. Yeah. So you got your dream job and did was it just like a flick of a switch and everything was fine or,
So let's see, I got out of the psych hospital in January. I told you I was working in higher ed, right? Let's fast forward to May. My boss was crazy. And I'm still working with that coworker, right? That broke up with me. I was just like, when I got out of psych hospital and I was a little bit more empowered, I was like, you don't get a breakup with me. I get a breakup with you and we're not breaking up. So we fast forward, she's kind of nuts. And she was screaming at him one day. Keep in mind, I'm still struggling with PTSD, right? So she's screaming at him and he's a veteran. I'm like, oh my God, what's going to happen? So I report her to HR and they are supposed to suspend her for multiple weeks. They don't. And he's sitting next to me one day and I was like, just quit, just quit. And he starts packing his stuff up at like 9:15 in the morning. And I realized like, shit, it's just going to be me. So I packed my box up. I typed up our letters of resignation. I turned them into HR and we drove off at 10:30 in the morning. I don't know when she knew her only two employees quit, but we quit.
Oh.
So because I did that, I knew like I couldn't go back to higher ed. You don't get you don't get an invitation back when you quit that way. And
Mm.
so my dream job was to own a CrossFit gym. And then that's when I was like, all right. So I reached out, sent an email like, oh, I have money. I'll partner up with you. He's like, nope, I'll sell you the whole thing. Sold me the CrossFit gym, which was the dream job, right? I loved coaching, but the entrepreneur side was hard. Like how to sell, marketing. And anytime someone quit, it felt like they were breaking up with me.
Mm.
It was just like I didn't have rejection resilience, right?
Hmm.
So no, it was not life was hunky dory fine. It was hard. Um, but it gave me the courage to believe myself for the first time. So I sold it and then I found coaching and I was like, this is it. Like this is the keys to the universe when I learned the model, right? I'm like, this is how I'm going to help people.
Yeah.
And
So
then
that's
this
like
side,
it's like finding your life purpose, isn't it?
yes.
It gives you that buzz.
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell us now a little bit about what you're doing now then.
Okay. So yeah, I started coaching. I studied under Brooke for 2 years, with the model, and then I started my coaching business. And my best friend, business partner, is a licensed naturopathic doctor. And we have a podcast together. And I was like obsessed with Elon Musk. I'm like, what makes Elon different from the rest of us? If I know the model that our thoughts create our results, like what makes him so different? And Carmen just looks at me. She goes, "Oh, well, it's serotonin. That's the self-confidence chemical and rejection resilience chemical. And when it's not balanced, it's really hard to have rejection resilience. People find rejection devastating. Remember the word I used when people would leave the gym? It was devastating." And I was like, "Oh, that's why things have been so hard for me. It's
Yeah.
because serotonin hasn't been balanced in me." Right?
That's given me goosebumps. I think that affects a lot of people.
Yeah. And I hate now, like when I talk about this stuff, because people are like, yeah, there's people with mental illnesses, they're like chemically imbalanced. And it's like, no. If you're a human that experiences chronic stress, you are 100% chemically imbalanced. Yeah. So then I started adding that to my coaching practice where I test neurotransmitters and hormones and my clients. And I work with highly functioning women that want to live in their full potential, right? So I test that so we can balance it out with food and supplements because our hormones impact our brain chemicals, right? It's
Hmm.
this situation and it impacts how we think and how we feel. And like if serotonin's too high, we feel anxiety in our body. If serotonin's too low, we feel anxiety in our body, right?
Mm, mm,
So yeah, so that's where I started diving in. Well, how does the brain work and how do we kind of biohack it so we can think how we want to and feel how we want to? And then a part of my business is definitely like talking about the mental health system and how it's broke. Like there's no
yeah.
reason, right? I have a
Yeah.
master's degree in counseling. I went to therapy. There's no reason I should have ended up in a psych hospital. Like the system's broke.
Mm. It's I've lost the word, but it's like we're not we don't have the knowledge. We don't have the right knowledge about how to to do things like this and to have, rejection resilience and, keep your levels and be balanced. And we just, it's not taught for a start, and it should be.
Yeah. Like, you know what the kicker of all this is? Is like, remember in the beginning when you said that like I've struggled with suicide ideation since I was 13? Guess when my first period was? 13. So as Carmen and I've dug into it, genetically I have MTHFR gene, right? And it makes from my first period, I have been estrogen dominant. That means that my progesterone levels are low. Okay.
Hmm.
When progesterone levels are low, because progesterone converts into cortisol and it converts into sex hormones, right? And it's also like when you have estrogen dominance, you struggle with anxiety, suicide ideation, depression, infertility, a weakened immune system, PCOS, endometriosis, right?
Hormones have a lot to answer for.
Nobody ever like I go out through all my teens and I'm struggling with depression and SI. Like that's just being a teenager, right? I hit my early 30s, find out I'm infertile and can't get pregnant. Like no one stops to think like maybe there's something going on with her hormones that set me up to like,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Yeah. It's crazy. And it does, on a tangent, drive me a bit mad that schools and education don't focus on things like this that can, ultimately improve your mental health if you've got the facts and the knowledge surrounding it.
Your ability to learn even,
Mm.
right? Like if schools really care about us learning.
Mm. Well, that's a whole nother podcast, isn't it? I don't know what it's like in America, but the education system in England is just, there's so many people who are now home educating because they just they just don't agree with 90% of it.
Yeah, same
But as I
here.
say, that is a different podcast. Do you know what? I think that is a perfect time to wrap it up, Kimberly. Thank you so much for sharing
Yeah,
your
for sure.
story. Honestly, there's so much in there that I think listeners can really grab onto in terms of A, if they're suffering like you were, of how to get out of it, and B, if they're listening and they know somebody suffering, they might have a different approach, which could be a lot more beneficial.
Yeah.
So thank you
Good.
so much.
Yeah, thank you.
There's something that lives inside me. I promise I never let it out. Oh, it grows and divides inside me. It's making